All right, I'm with Richard Meagher. He's an associate political science professor at Randolph-Macon College and also the host of VPM's RVA's Got Issues. Thanks for talking to me today.
Sure, anytime, Ray.
So we're going to recap last night's primary elections, and there was a lot. It ended up being a pretty late night. Stoney just conceded to Ghazala Hashmi. Again, Hashmi won the nomination, the Democratic primary. Jay Jones won the Attorney General primary. Jones's race was a bit it was called by the Associated Press last night. I'm not sure if the Associated Press at this time is called the lieutenant governor's race, but it kind of surprised some people. Were you surprised that Hashmi, who was kind of considered an underdog to LeVar Stoney and Aaron Rouse, won this race?
Yeah, I think a little less surprised now than I would have been if you told me this a couple of months ago. I think when Hashmi entered the race, it's like you said, I think Rouse was considered much more of the favorite. I mean, Rouse has kind of been groomed by Democratic leaders, maybe not everybody, but some, as someone they kind of fast tracked into a Senate seat. It was a sports hero. The idea was that this is somebody who could be a really good Democratic leader. And so I think a lot of folks were looking at as he would be the best person for this position. Then, of course, Stoney entered the race. He was originally going to run for governor and then dropped down to the lieutenant governor. And so he was seen as a formidable force. And then Hashmi was kind of like an afterthought. She's like, a well respected, well regarded state senator, but she comes from the same part of Virginia as Stoney did. She's a senator like Rouse. But she is just one of these like Jen McClellan types, puts her head down and does the work. And McClellan, while she didn't win the nod for governor, right, Terry McAuliffe came in and pushed her out of the way. She was, sort of when she ran for Congress, like people love Ghazala Hashmi. Like people in Democratic politics, people who encounter her, they really respect her and love her. I think she was able to kind of get around the state, get around the Commonwealth this campaign season, and just kind of build momentum. I mean, this is a completely anecdotal and probably untrue a story, but I saw on Twitter somebody posted or X that when they saw, it might have been Chaz Nuttycombe, he said, like, when I see Stoney signs, they're in the median, and when I see Hashmi signs, they're in people's yards, right? And that's probably not exactly true, but that was the vibe, right? It was just that people really liked Hashmi, and she was able to turn that into an actual victory here. So, must have run a really good campaign and had people respond to who she was.
Yeah, the people really love her in the Richmond area.
Yeah.
Ever since she won in 2019, flipping the Republican seat, she's got a loyal fan base, and I really appreciate that comparison to Jennifer McClellan because she's kind of the same way. And they
Yeah.
both kind of always had the criticism of they're not the most exciting on the campaign trail.
Yeah.
They get the work done in their office, and they also just have a following that is very loyal.
Yeah.
And Hashmi really cleaned up here in Richmond.
Yeah.
I mean, if Stoney would have just got a few thousand votes here, he would have won the race. He performed well in the rest of the state. And so did that surprise you? I mean, I know he's had his issues, and I kind of looked at this in conversations with people. They would be like, well, Stoney has all these issues from Richmond with the P cards and with the water crisis happening 6 days after he left office. But people outside of Richmond don't read City of Richmond news, and that
Yeah.
showed itself last night with Stoney coming just a few thousand votes from winning. So, did it surprise you how much she beat him by in the city to really? I mean, it was kind of a dominant showing. I haven't looked at the final results, but last I checked, he was in like fourth or fifth out of the six candidates in the city of Richmond.
Yeah. It was something like 60 to 20, roughly, like, in terms of his vote share. Hashmi is 60. Yeah. I mean, it kind of surprised me both ways. And maybe this is the Richmonder in me. I was surprised that Stoney did as well across the state because I really did think some of the criticism about him from Richmond might leak out into the campaign. But the the worry I think for people who wanted Stoney to win was that he might be a little bit too much flash, too much Mac money, right? Terry McAuliffe's money. But he was able to turn that into support all across the Commonwealth, except in Richmond. I actually do. I'm surprised by the depth of people's. The haters came out last night in Richmond, and I do think the water crisis really hurt him. Right, he was always I think a mixed bag here. He left with a a mixed legacy, had some supporters still, particularly among black voters in the city of Richmond and the surrounding area. But I think that water crisis really just people recognize that whatever happened, this wasn't the current mayor, Danny Avula's fault. It had to have happened on the previous watch. And then in Richmond, I think he came out and said, well, actually, it was really the fault of the mayor before me, Dwight Jones, and that did not go over well in Richmond either.
No,
So I'm surprised that both Stoney got so close all across the state, and that he did so poorly in Richmond. And again, I really do think that the timing of the water crisis really hurt him. If it had happened, maybe later after this election, people in Richmond would still be blaming Stoney, but I don't think they would hold him kind of personally directly responsible.
yeah, and well, it's interesting. I just found this out today, but we'll talk more about Clean Virginia and Dominion later. But in the last 4 days of the race, Clean Virginia was running ads in Northern Virginia, uh, attacking Stoney. Stoney takes
Yeah,
in energy money. And again, I'll put this out in my story later today. It hasn't been reported anywhere yet, but they put those ads out in Northern Virginia, I think, trying to bring attention to the Richmond issues that, again, Richmonders knew about, but like I said, most of the rest of the state had no idea. So
yeah,
interesting to see if that really had any impact, because again, it's just a few thousand votes that he lost by, and it was close.
yeah.
Now switching to Aaron Rouse, he was a lot of people's favorite for the first maybe 85% of this race, and then he kind of, I don't know if fell off is the right word, but he wasn't really in the conversation as much. The conversation shifted from Rouse versus Stoney to Stoney versus Gonzala. And
Yeah.
so it's really interesting to see how that happened. Do you have any like thoughts on what happened to his campaign?
I mean, I think it was probably just, and maybe he could have overcome this with a more dynamic campaign. I don't know that much about the ins and outs of his strategy, but this was always going to come down to kind of intersection of regionalism and identity. And he certainly had the Tidewater region locked down pretty well, and it was kind of going to be more between Stoney and Hashmi about how they sorted that out. But I also think we don't talk. You don't want to reduce everything to race and ethnicity here, but Rouse and Stoney being both black candidates in the race meant that black voters, if they were looking for a candidate that represented them in that way, had two choices, right? So it meant that even out in Rouse's stronghold out in the Tidewater region, there were still folks there who went for Stoney, right? Still black voters who decided that Stoney might be a better representative. Again, just because you're a black voter doesn't mean you vote for a black candidate, but I think folks in the Democratic Party particularly look for representation. They want to make sure that their voices are heard. And so I do think that Stoney and Rouse were sort of overlapping and stealing, I want to say stealing votes from each other, but certainly competing for similar percentages of the black vote there. And one other factor we didn't talk about that I think we shouldn't forget about in Virginia more and more, right? The South Asian population, particularly Indian Americans in Northern Virginia, right? Hashmi is connected to those folks. And whenever I talk about this, I always try to make sure it's not like sinister, right? It's a growing immigrant force. The communities that have come over from India, they're particularly well resourced, right? A lot of folks are coming over to work in tech and work in government. They're not the typical kind of immigrants starting out in the low rung and working their way up. They're coming in with resources, with education, and really interested in politics. And Hashmi's been able to, I think, leverage her connection to that community in a way to help mobilize support that I think we sometimes overlook. So race and ethnicity plays a role here in all of those candidacies.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with that. I know a lot of people say identity politics shouldn't matter, but if you look at both of these statewide tickets, it's the most diverse race we've ever had. There's not a straight
Yeah,
man on the ticket. And when you look at these populations of people, they want to be represented. They want to see something personal to them represented in higher office. And so
yeah,
it does have an impact. There's no way to deny that. But Hashmi's put in the work and stuff like that. So I think her work ethic really played a big part in it as well, because like I said, she cleaned up in Richmond, which is a black city,
Yeah,
majority black city. So it's just interesting to see all these dynamics and how they played out.
good.
Um, so let's shift to the Attorney General race. Jay Jones, he won by last I saw like 2 percentage points over Shannon Taylor. The race was called last night. That was a bit closer than I was expecting maybe 3 or 4 months ago. I mean, in this last week or so, it looked 50-50. So in the final days, yeah, it kind of turned out like this. But Jay launched early. Jay's been running his campaign essentially since he lost the primary in 2021 to Mark Herring, the two-term incumbent, and he kind of overperformed in that primary. I mean, he was younger than me at that point. He was running against a two-term powerhouse
Yeah,
incumbent who used to be a state senator. He raised a lot of money, and a lot of people viewed him as overperforming, and then instantly made him the favorite for the nomination this year. He had basically the full establishment of Democratic support. I mean, and he beat Shannon by 2 points, and I think identity politics had a bit to do with this as well. Women tend to perform really well in Democratic
yeah.
primaries. Again, it's just identity politics. But what do you think of this race? Were you surprised to see it this close? Were you surprised to see Jay won? What's your thoughts on it?
I'm not surprised about both. Actually, I'm not surprised that it was this close. I think Shan Taylor has more support among Democrats, Democratic establishment Democrats, than we kind of know. So you mentioned that Jay Jones decided to challenge Mark Herring back 4 years ago. Shan Taylor was planning to run in that race if Mark Herring hadn't decided to opt out of running for governor. Right? The plan had originally been Herring, had endorsed Ralph Northam, was going to wait his turn to run for governor. Then the whole blackface scandal thing happened, and Herring decided, you know what, it's better for me to just run as an incumbent for attorney general, not try to challenge for governor. And that kind of crowded Shannon Taylor out of the race. She looked at the landscape and said, I can't beat Mark Herring. I'm not going to run. But she'd been laying the groundwork even, 6, 7, 8 years ago for this run. So I'm not that surprised that she found the support that she needed to come close to taking on Jay Jones, even though Jay Jones had raised more money, had more support, more endorsements, has that, powerful connection from his political family. As his father passed away just not that long ago in the campaign, who was a powerful, a Democratic politico in Virginia. But but I think you're right about like gender identity politics mattered. I think that also her experience, like she was kind of trying out a little bit of the Jason Miyares argument against Jay Jones, which is
Yeah,
that Jay Jones is a neophyte. Jay Jones doesn't know how to prosecute. He is running as a politician, as a policy person, as a legislator, and Shannon Taylor says I'm the tough nosed, Commonwealth's attorney who's actually prosecuted cases,
yeah,
and that's what you need to be in the attorney general's office. So I think she was trying that out, and it was helpful in some cases. I think people looked at her experience and said, well, can we really vote for? And sometimes Democratic voters do this; they sort of galaxy brain themselves into who's most electable and who do I want. And it's
yeah.
not a question of who they like; it's who they think can win. So all of that, I think, contributed to her coming really close to winning this election. But it's not surprising to me that Jay eventually came out on top just because of all those advantages that you mentioned.
Yeah. And Shannon really ran on that prosecutorial experience, which honestly is not a big part of the job. The Attorney General's job is mostly to defend the Commonwealth and look out for the entrance. There's not much criminal prosecution at all. And again, it's like what you said, it's very similar to how Jason Miyares ran. He says he's the top cop. I sat down with him for a Q&A like a month or so ago, and during that interview, he pulled out his badge 3 times to put emphasis on what he was saying. And while I can appreciate that as like a 33-year-old man who just thinks like badges are cool, like
Yeah, right.
that's cool color for my story and for me. But at the end of the day, the Attorney General defends the Commonwealth in a lot of issues, while Jay ran on his legislative experience and standing up to Trump and joining these lawsuits against Trump. I don't think most people understand that the Attorney General is not out here prosecuting crimes, and most crimes are left to the locality's Commonwealth's attorneys. So Do you think that really hit, or do you think like the fact that most people didn't even know there was a primary, let alone knows who the attorney general is or does? What is the impact you think that could have had? Could that have helped her get her closer to the win, or what?
Yeah, so I would push back a little bit on that. If the and certainly the Miaris people would push back a lot on this, and they have with me too, right? They will argue that because they have like 400 lawyers, they are prosecuting like trafficking cases and cyber crimes and things like that, like the stuff. But that's not what I think. I think you're right that most people, when they think, oh, you're the attorney general, you must prosecute murder cases, right? You must when somebody robs an ABC store, you're the person who locks them up. That's not how it works. Like you're saying, it's the Commonwealth's attorneys, it's the local folks who do that. So I think the truth is a little bit in between, but Miaris is going to try to make it seem like all we do is be a tough prosecutor, like I'm running for Commonwealth's attorney and I'm the law and order guy, I'm the badge guy. And so Jay Jones's job is in part to kind of explain what the attorney general does in his view, right? To make that kind of argument that, the attorney general, yeah, there's some crime stuff, but it's also all this policy stuff. It's joining in these national lawsuits and deciding which side of those lawsuits to be on. So I do think there's a kind of education piece for Jay Jones that's a little bit harder to do than what Miaris has to do. Miaris just has to flash the badge. Miaris just has to say, I'm the tough guy, right? I think it's an easier, simpler story to tell. Then Jones will probably have a tougher road. Doesn't mean he can't do it. And particularly in this environment where everyone's watching tough guys like Donald Trump and ICE officials, like, in masks, doing these mass raids. I think the law and order might be a little harder to push this year because of that environment. So I'm not saying he's therefore doomed in making that case, but it's going to be interesting to watch how Jones navigates all this.
So, Clean Virginia gave $400,000 to Jay Jones. Their mortal enemy, their arch nemesis, Dominion Energy, ended up giving $800,000 to Shannon Taylor. Clean Virginia's criticism is the Attorney General's position is to, oversee Dominion in a way, defend the Commonwealth, help people of the Commonwealth get the best deals they can from Dominion, which is provides our power.
Yeah.
Without Dominion, we can't exist. We wouldn't be able to be doing this. My computer wouldn't charge. And so we have to pay Dominion, and Dominion is just giving all this money to our politicians. And that's Clean Virginia's argument. Clean Virginia is also being funded by Michael Bills, who basically has to be a billionaire at this point.
Yeah.
The amount of money he's just throwing at politicians. And the pro-Dominion people say, well, this is just one man buying influence in the government. Their rivalry really came to a head in this battle. Clean Virginia went on the attack. They were running hundreds of thousands of dollars worth of attack ads against Shannon in the final week. They were putting signs up at polling stations. They were running, like I mentioned earlier, an ad against LeVar Stoney in the final days of the election because Stoney took Dominion money. Do you think regular voters, let me rephrase that. Do you think primary voters, because regular voters and primary voters are not
Right.
the same thing. Do you think primary voters in this primary really cared about Dominion and Clean in Virginia?
I mean, maybe to a 2 percentage point, right? I don't think a ton of people did, but in a race that's won in the margins, I certainly think it probably helped,
Yeah.
right? Because and less so, for it's hard to make this case against a nonprofit called Clean Virginia, right? The idea is it is funded by this shadowy guy. No one's quite sure what his motivation is. Is it really just out of the goodness of his heart? Is he somehow benefiting financially from clean technology? I mean, all those kind of speculations always been kind of circulated about bills and Clean Virginia. But Dominion, we know, right? Dominion is the devil we know and has been the most influential force in Virginia politics for the last couple of decades, let alone, individuals or companies or whatever. I think you want to explain Virginia politics over the last couple of decades, you look to Dominion. And Dominion lost this time around, right? They clearly thought this race was important and invested a ton of money into it. So they must have wanted something or thought they could get something from a friendly attorney general. And it looks like, at least depending on how they spend in the general election, Jay Jones wins, they're not going to have that.
Yeah.
So I think that the story that probably had the most impact was Clean Virginia saying, Shannon Taylor got hundreds of $1,000s from Dominion. What's that about? Right? I think that was enough to raise questions in people's mind. If they were trying to decide between Taylor and Jones, that's enough to be like, I don't know if I like that. I've heard of Dominion. I know I pay my bills to them. I don't like that they're so involved in politics. So I think that, the nuances of the battle between Clean Virginia and Dominion and all that, I do think that that was certainly harmful. Did it cost the race? I don't know.
Yeah.
Lots of things could have, but certainly wasn't helpful.
I also think it helps when Jay Jones's campaign pointed this out. Dominion is the biggest donor to Republican Attorney General Jason Miyares, and in a
Mm-hmm.
Democratic primary, I think primary voters care about that. They want a
Yeah.
Democrat. They don't want someone who's beholden to the same people as Republicans. So I think it was interesting. I was I was on both sides of the fence. I was like, yes, Clean Virginia is putting Shannon Taylor's name out there with these attack ads, and but I think the attack ad was well crafted.
Yeah.
I mean, you had like a kid breathing through an oxygen mask, burning trees. It was interesting. All right, before we talk about these Richmond area House primaries, let's talk about November. So
Mm-hmm.
Gonzalo versus John Reed, who is marred in all of that issues. And I like the pun I just used with your last name, by the way. But
Yeah.
dealing with all these issues of Glenn Youngkin asking him to step down. And if you're watching this and you don't know what's happened, go look up John Reed, Glenn Youngkin, Winsome Sears. It's quite a tumbler of controversy.
Yeah.
And so we have Gonzalo versus John. John's the first openly gay nominee on a statewide ticket. He's a Republican. He's very conservative. He's very pro Donald Trump. Um, and then you have Gonzalo, who's very anti-Trump. And so, what are you thinking of this race? We have the dynamics of Trump in office. It's always great for the opposite party. I think everyone's expecting Democrats to win. John Reed's raised very little money. I think he was like around $150,000 this last reporting period when you had House candidates across the Commonwealth raising more than that in that same period. So what is your outlook? What are you expecting from this general election on the LG?
I mean, it's hard because the LG dynamic is so much situated within the broader dynamic of the gubernatorial race,
Yeah.
right? It is a separate election. You vote separately for lieutenant governor. You technically could vote for, Winsome Sears and Ghazala Hashmi if you wanted to split your ticket that way. It's not likely these days, but it's possible. So I think Hashmi will try to provide support to Spanberger. She'll be a team player. People are already asking, like, you guys have seemed to differ on your vision of right to work, and Hashmi is saying like she will, she'll see about that. We'll have conversations. So I do think that there's going to be a support there that isn't necessarily around on the Republican side. John Reed is kind of free to go around and do what he wants right now
Yeah.
because Sears isn't interested in hanging around with him. So there's a wild card element to what Reed will be able to do. At the same time, if he's not able to raise money, if he's frozen out of the Republican establishment the way he so far has been, then what we might get is this dynamic of, Ghazala Hashmi being well funded and running around the Commonwealth and appearing with Abigail Spanberger and kind of ignoring John Reed, right? John Reed kind of buzzing around trying to bother her, the sort of pesky fly at a large, I don't know, horse or something that's just swatting at the fly with its tail. Not to call Ghazala Hashmi a horse or anything. I don't know. That was a metaphor I came up with. But that's entirely possible, right? Unless Reed gets brought into the fold, unless he gets a little better supported by Republican establishment, he could get marginalized in this race. And we may not see an engagement at all between Hashmi and Reed, right? Maybe no debates, maybe no connection. That's certainly one possible outcome just based on the way things go. Now, if Reed's brought back in a little bit more, I think, there could be some more engagement. There could be a forum or debate farther as we get closer to November. But I'll be watching to see. I think really all it depends on what happens on the Republican side more than the Democrats.
And then Jason Miyares is the only incumbent running in any of these races. I mean, Lieutenant Governor Sears, she's technically an elected official at the statewide level, but Miyares is running for the same job again against Jones. Do you think that gives Miyares the best chance of reelection out of anyone on the Republican ticket?
Yeah, I do. I mean, him being an incumbent, him being able to make, I mean, it's always a default mode in Republican politics for law and order. But it's an easy mode and one that's very effective. Preying on people's fears, talking about crime. The immigration thing runs both ways. It's the people are outraged by these ICE raids, but at the same time, they're kind of fed up with immigration, kind of more generally. There is stronger support for the Trump administration on that issue than a lot of others. So I think he's running from a position of strength, and we're already seeing he's already floating his campaign arguments against Jay Jones as a weak liberal, a social justice warrior, someone who isn't a serious candidate that we should pay any attention to. So I do think there's a path of victory for Miyares. Like, let's say the Republicans just sort of implode and Sears' campaign goes nowhere. Miyares still has a chance to win, right? As a sitting attorney general running for re-election, he could make a kind of separate case against Jay Jones that still carries the day in a close election.
Yeah, it's going to be wild. So I have about 6 minutes left before Zoom makes me pay money for this report. Let's talk about these House primaries. All right. So we have three Richmond area districts. You have HD, what is this? HD 57, David Owen, who won barely over Susanna Gibson in 2023, despite her scandal. And then we have in 2024, according to VPAP, Kamala Harris won this district by 9 points. That is May Navarre. She won the Democratic
Yeah.
primary last night. Any thoughts on this race?
Yeah, I mean, the May Navarre has been groomed by Democrats for this role. Maybe not this particular one, but she's an Altria employee, a Chinese American, but she's very well connected, has been very active in Democratic politics over the last 10, 20 years, heavily endorsed and supported and funded by Democrats. Like, they really see this as winnable. They wanted a strong candidate. They believe in May Navarre and really think that she's going to take this seat in the Henrico suburbs. And this and these other districts that we're going to talk about, these suburbs are becoming more and more like urban areas, right? The closer suburbs. I've been singing this song for a decade now, that suburbs in America really are becoming more like cities than they are like rural areas. The problems they face, the people and their ideology there, they're becoming more democratic in a lot of ways. That doesn't mean they always vote Republican. I mean, always vote Democratic. They can vote Republican. Glenn Youngkin was able to turn some of those districts his way. But in a year that you're expecting a blue wave, where you're going to get those pickups for the Democrats are in districts just like this one. And David Owen's really in trouble this year as far as trying to get reelected.
All right, and then we have HD 75, Delegate Kerry Coyner. Lindsay Doherty won the Democratic primary last night. She ran against Coyner in 2019, I believe. It's a new district. It's more friendly to Democrats. Kamala Harris won it by 6 points last year, according to VPAP. What are your thoughts on this district and Lindsay's campaign? And Kerry, who a lot of people know in the district, she was on the school board. Her family is well known in the district. She's very moderate.
Yeah.
In my opinion, this is the hardest pickup opportunity for Democrats, but it's definitely possible if you look at the numbers.
Yeah, I think even in a somewhat small blue wave election, Coyner could still win because she's so well liked in the district. Partisanship is a hell of a drug, as they say, and people, Democrats in the district might be willing to kick her out just to get a Democrat in there. But she is been very smartly kind of positioning herself and trying to avoid stepping into too big controversies. I also, just Kerry Coyner, I don't know her personally, but just observing her from afar, in a previous era of Republican politics, I think she would have lived very comfortably in the moderate middle of the Republican Party. That middle doesn't really exist much anymore. So she's very much an outlier. But she is well liked there, and it's going to be tough for Doherty to knock her off. I mean, Doherty also defeated the other candidate who took on Kerry Coyner in the last election, Stephen Miller Pitt. So it was clear that previous opponents of Coyner think that they can finally take her down this year. I don't know if there's any particular reason to love or hate Doherty. At least she's run a campaign before, so she knows the district and or at least some part of it, and could could benefit from a blue wave here. But I think you're right. This is going to be a tough one, and even if Democrats win the state roughly by 3 or 4 points, it has to be more than that for I think for Corner to really be in danger here.
All right, we've got about a minute and a half. Let's talk about HD 73. That's Mark Early. He won by like 9 points in 2023, but Kamala also won his district last year by less than 1 percentage point, though. Um, so Leslie Mehta won the primary last night, and she's kind of been hidden early. We just talked about Corner being a moderate, getting a lot of legislation passed, but Early's on the opposite. He's pretty far right. He's
Yeah.
never passed a bill in his 2 years, and Mehta's hit him for it. So, what are your thoughts on this district?
Yeah, I think despite the district maybe not being as favorable, I do think that Meta has a good shot. I mean, and she ran a congressional campaign. She's battle tested, and certainly is well known in Virginia from her congressional campaign. Has hopefully not burned any bridges from donors. Again, it's one of these cases where I think people will look at her as a credible candidate. So outside donor money will be really helpful there. For her and for May Navarre, like people that want to bet on a race that they hope they can win and have an impact on, this is probably one where they really feel like the Democrats really feel like they can pick it up.
All right, Richard Meagher from Randolph-Macon College, and you can also hear him on host. He's hosting VPM's RVA's Got Issues. I appreciate your time, man. This was fun.
Yeah, anytime, Brandon.
All right.